National debt.
The national debt.
The national debt.
The U.S. has borrowed more and more money. As a comparison to the share of GDP, it's around 100%, the highest since World War II.
Stock prices falling, interest rates rising, probably the dollar falling too. And that could affect a wide range of your own financial life.
That any great power that spends more interest payments on its debt than on defense won't be great for much longer.
The government should be neutral. The government should spend as much as it gets back in taxation. Well, YouTube put this video into my feed recently, and it's an interview by these two apparently stand-up comedians on their show called Trigonometry, and they interviewed Niall Ferguson. Now, Niall Ferguson is the author of The Ascent of Money, a renowned scholar on the history of money. As is inevitable, they asked him a question about government debt.
On economics and finance that I think is a giant problem. We don't seem to be able to live within our means. We really are in trouble in that aspect of things, are we not?
Yes, deep trouble. This is the problem. What does it lead to? It leads to there being deficits every year, and not just in the bad years. The deficits every year. In the US, 6+% of GDP every year, as far as the eye can see. Gross debt, now above 120% of GDP, higher than it was at the end of World War II. This is not sustainable. I said Ferguson's law states that any great power that spends more interest payments on its debt than on defense won't be great for much longer.
Well, if Ferguson can make up a law, so can I. And my law is, whereas Ferguson's law is that any great power that spends more on interest than defence won't be a great power for much longer, my law is that virtually everybody who pontificates about money doesn't understand double entry bookkeeping. Now, why does that matter? Because they make fundamental errors. Money is fundamentally a creature of double entry bookkeeping. And really, about the only two commentators you can rely upon to get this right are myself and Richard Murphy. Double entry bookkeeping has been the foundation of our monetary system ever since the 1500s. In fact, there's a good argument to be made that double entry bookkeeping enabled capitalism in the first place because you could keep track of financial transactions, who owns what, who owes whom, how much money's existence. It all comes down to double entry bookkeeping. And this is something which the Italians kept to themselves until the invention of the Gutenberg press. And at that stage, this monk, Father Luca Pacioli, published a book which included a chapter called Double Entry. And in that he explained how the merchants of Venice kept track of financial transactions. They wrote two entries on their ledger. They had one side showing credit entries and the other showing debit entries, and they made sure they had to have a credit entry and a debit entry on every line. Now, in modern parlance, what we do is we classify all claims as either assets or liabilities. Your assets are a claim on somebody else. Liabilities are somebody else's claim upon you, and you record every transaction occurs twice, once as a debit entry and once as a credit entry. Now, I know this sounds about as exciting as watching grass grow, but it's absolutely critical if you want to understand how to manage a monetary economy. And frankly, because most people get this completely wrong, they manage the economy in a completely damaging way, and a large part of our conundrums today are caused by people not understanding double entry bookkeeping. The loanable funds model can't explain demand deposits. This time I'm going to say, what would it look like if we actually understood double entry bookkeeping? First off, what sort of system would we design? This is showing the debits and credit side of how accountants operate in my Ravel software. It takes quite a while to learn when you should classify something as a debit and something else as a credit. So Ravel has a simpler method, which is to say that since your assets minus your liability equals your equity or net worth, then assets minus liability minus equity must equal zero. And it then checks on every line that this actually applies with the transactions, and it uses positive and negative entries. So the positive entries here are the black ones, the negative are the red ones, and it makes sure that each row sums to zero according to that equation, assets minus liabilities minus equity equals zero, which is done over here. So having set it up that way, what I want to do is build the simplest possible model of the financial system. And for that, I need four sectors. I need both the central bank and the Treasury, because they're involved in government money creation, and I need banks and the non-banks for the private sector. So I create four godly tables, each with assets and liabilities empty, and I'm showing the equity of the central bank, the Treasury, the banks, and the private sector as the sum of whatever I'm going to put into those assets and liabilities columns. Now, I'm going to start with the private sector and look at what happens when banks make loans to non-banks. And for banks, of course, loans are going to be an asset. and the deposit accounts that they also have to manage are liabilities. For the non-banks, loans are liabilities and deposits are an asset. So when I put loans and deposits into this pattern, I have the obvious consequence in double entry bookkeeping terms that debt is an asset of the banks and a liability of the households, and deposits are a liability of the banks and an asset of households and firms. This actually leads to a very profound reality that is again missed by the vast majority of commentators, and that is for one entity to be in positive financial equity, the rest of the system has to be in identical negative financial equity with respect to that initial entity. So if we take a look at banks and non-banks here, I have banks having the asset of debt worth 100, deposits of 90, a liability, so the net worth of the banking sector is 10, and therefore that means that the net worth of the household sector is minus 10. 100 is an asset for the bank, it's a liability for the households. 90 is a liability for the bank, it's an asset for the households. Therefore the banks have got net equity of 10 and the household sector is net equity of minus 10. Now that's not something you can correct in any sense. This is a conservation law. You cannot break conservation laws, and therefore if the banks are in positive equity, the rest of the economy is in negative equity of exactly the same magnitude with respect to the banks. And this is because the sum of all financial assets and financial liabilities is zero. What are called non-financial assets, which are things like houses, companies, shares, etc., etc. So the sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. And this means, in that sense, the banking sector functions like a seesaw. If one side is up, the other side has to be down. So to have positive equity for one entity, there must be negative equity for all the other entities. And that is absolutely unavoidable. Banks are required by law to have liquid assets that exceed their short-term liabilities, and there are basically two reasons for this. One is the legal requirement. The other is that if there is a bank run, then a bank that has liabilities that exceed its asset certainly can't meet all its depositors' demands. So by definition, a bank must have positive net worth. That therefore means that the rest of society is in a negative, and you can't get out of this through bank loans. Bank loans create deposits. This is something which again is something that's not understood by most commentators. Most economists refuse to understand that point. But what you have here is lending is going to increase the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector identically and increase the assets and liabilities of the households and firms identically. There's no change to the equity. You start off with negative equity for the private non-banks, you stay there. Lending by the banks simply can't get you out of that trap. There's no net equity created by lending. So this means that non-banks are necessarily in negative equity with respect to the banking sector. So rather than the flat thing I showed earlier for the seesaw, the actual slope starts off shaped like this. The banks are necessarily up there. Therefore, the rest of society, government, private sector, everything you care to name, is in negative financial equity of exactly the same magnitude. They're on the downside of the seesaw. But nobody likes being in negative equity. This means that your debts exceed your assets. It's an uncomfortable situation for everybody, and this is one reason why governments panic about it. It feels uncomfortable to governments as well, but I want to explain why that's the wrong way to think about it. So we know that the non-bank private sector in a pure credit economy has to be in negative equity. So how do they respond to that? Well, we can actually get an idea of that by looking at the 19th century. Now, the 19th century is a period of great innovation and growth around the world, but it was not a period of financial stability by any stretch of imagination. Again, one thing you probably would not realise is that the government in America, for example, worth only about 3% of GDP. It was actually about 1/10 the scale that government is today. Watch all the westerns you like, see the sheriffs go out to the rescue, watch the Treasury slaughter the Indians. None of that stuff amounts to more than 2 or 3% of GDP at any period in the 19th century. Governments also, just as like governments are today, governments in the 19th century obsessed about getting their debt levels down to zero. So if you take a look at the level of private debt and government debt, what you find is the dotted line is government debt. And throughout the whole 19th century, the government attempted to reduce its debt levels. Down there, and down there. Now, this necessarily drove the non-bank private sector into negative financial equity. And what did it do in response to that? It borrowed from the banks to gamble on the value of non-financial assets. You'd buy shares in railways, you'd buy real estate, some way to get a non-financial asset, hope that its price rises, and then compensates for the fact that you're in negative financial equity. The nature of the 19th century was a whole series of bubbles and busts in different shares and houses and so on. And you can see this effect here. As government's reducing its debt level, the private sector increases it. And again here, and most dramatically in the 1920s. Now, this led to bouts of positive and negative credit. Credit is the annual change in private debt. And you can see on the bottom chart here, all these points where credit is massively negative. And the worst of the lot, according to census figures, being the 1930s. Now, that stopped after the Great Depression and World War II. And one consequence of the Great Depression and World War II was an increase in the size of the government. Unemployment benefits came in, public health came in, public education, and of course the military. So the government rose from about 3% of GDP in the 19th century to about 20% of GDP in the 20th century. And what that has meant is many other effects. One is there's only been one period of negative credit since World War II, and that's the global financial crisis. The post-war financial system has been more stable than what applied in the 19th century because the government's negative equity enabled the private sector to be in positive equity, and therefore the panic that occurred through negative equity in the 19th century no longer happens on the same scale that it did back then. So think about it in terms of that seesaw again. And imagine we've added a third actor to the seesaw. You necessarily start from this situation where banks on the upside of the seesaw and households and firms are on the negative side. What conventional commentators want, and that includes Niall Ferguson in that interview, they think the government should be neutral. The government should spend as much as it gets back in taxation. That is a fallacy because if the government does decide to balance its books, it necessarily pushes the households and firms into negative financial equity, which is what led to the financial volatility of the 19th century. If, on the other hand, the government goes into negative equity by spending more than it gets back in taxation, that pushes the households and firms into positive financial equity. So even though nobody likes being in negative equity, the government, by doing it, enables the rest of the economy to be in positive financial equity. So how does it all happen? Well, let's add government taxation and spending to that very simple model I'm putting together here. So taxation, when you look at it from the point of view of the private sector, taxation reduces the net worth of the private sector. And that should be obvious. If the government takes tax money out of your deposit account goes down, nothing else compensates to increase it. So taxation reduces the equity of the private sector. How does the government get the funds from taxation? Well, they get to the government via reserves because the matching entry for the banks now, when deposits fall, is that reserves also fall. So reserves go down. Now, what that means at the level of the central bank is that's occurring because funds are being transferred from the reserve accounts of the banks to the government's account at the central bank. And because that happens, taxation increases the net worth of the government. So taxation gives the government positive financial equity and gives the non-bank private sector negative equity. So that's what taxation does, and that should be obvious to everybody. What about government spending? Well, this will be not obvious to a lot of people who are always critical of government spending, because government spending is the exact opposite of what taxation does. So let's add government spending inside here. And what spending does, first of all, is increase the financial equity of the private sector. The money turns up in your deposit account, you don't get any matching liability with it, so government spending increases the financial net worth of the private sector. And again, that is something which most economists have no idea of because they don't understand double entry bookkeeping. Now, those funds turn up in your deposit accounts because they turn up, first of all, in reserves. They're earmarked for your account or other people's accounts. That's the operation of the bank. The way that the banks get those funds is because they're transferred from the government's account at the central bank to the reserve accounts of the banks in the first instance. The final question is, government spending is financed by the government going into negative equity deliberately. This is a result of passing laws require the government to pay unemployment benefits and things of that nature when the economy turns down and so on. That government spending is done by the government deliberately going into negative equity. And this is all done without government debt. Notice I haven't got a single entry yet there for government bonds or anything of that nature. So I'm showing, using double entry bookkeeping, that government debt is not necessary for the government to create money. This is, again, an insight you can only get from understanding the double entry bookkeeping. Government deficits are not a bug, they're a feature. They're a necessary element in how the government creates fiat-backed money. And they have positive impacts on the non-government sectors because the private non-bank sector, leaving aside the foreign sector for now, the private non-bank sector can be in positive financial equity if and only if the government creates fiat money. And that's what happens when the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. That's absolutely critical to the creation of fiat money. Rather than it being something you should only do in the bad times, it's something which you have to do virtually all the time to create fiat-backed money, which balances the credit-backed money created by the banking sector. And it doesn't require government debt. No government debt turns up there at all. So that is a complete difference to how the private sector behaves. Again, this is not obvious to commentators. Ferguson is obviously implying that for government to spend more than it takes back in taxation, it must go into debt. There is no debt in this model as yet, but the government is creating money nonetheless. So the private sector and the government system differ on that front. Private banks can only create money by creating debt. The government creates money by going into negative equity. Debt is not necessary at this stage. So what I want to do now is illustrate this with an extremely simple simulation model. In this model, I'm going to have the turnover of money creating GDP. The money supply is fundamentally the sum of deposit accounts at private banks. Multiply that money by the velocity of money and you have GDP. Then lending is a fraction of GDP and I can vary that during a simulation. It can be positive or negative. Government spending and taxation are also fractions of GDP and I can vary those during the simulation. And spending minus taxes equals fiat money creation. So that's the incredibly simple model. Let's see how it behaves. The punchline is that private sector equity can be positive if and only if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation. So I'm starting off the model with no lending or government spending. Then we have lending, and that causes GDP to grow because the money supply is increased. If people pay off their debts and credit is negative, then GDP falls. Notice there's no change to the private sector's equity here. But once I have spending being greater than taxation, the private sector to be in positive equity. But this is balanced by the government being an identical negative equity with respect to the banks and the household sector and so on. And if you notice the sums in reserves and the government account here, the government has to go into overdraft in this system. To create money, which is what's happening here, the government account at the central bank must go into negative. So you'll notice that reserves are 39.3 and the government's account is minus 39.3, which shows the government is actually in overdraft to the central bank. This is nothing like an overdraft for a private sector institution because if you go into overdraft with your account at the bank, first of all, the bank can decide to shut your account down. They can decide not to let you go into overdraft. And if they do let you go into overdraft, they charge penalty rates of interest. All these things that happen to households and firms do not happen to the government because the government owns its central bank. This is absolutely critical. The government owns the bank through which it goes into overdraft. If the Treasury decides to go into overdraft, the central bank simply has to accommodate that. But it looks bad, okay? It looks bad because it looks like the whole system depends upon the government being in overdraft at the central bank. Now, that's what bond sales fix. When you take a look at the accounting properly, it ends up that bonds are not necessary to finance government spending. What bonds actually do is enable the government to go into negative financial equity, to have an account at the central bank that is not overdrawn. And I'll cover that in a subsequent video. If you've been feeling that something is off with the economy and this helped you put your finger on what it was, if that resonates with you, you're probably like the 22,000 others who recently requested one of my 3 books inside my new Ravel Economist book bundle. The bundle is worth $50, but you can get it while it's free this week. Click the link in the description or go to stevekeen.com. Once there, click on the black button, enter your email, and in about 60 seconds, we'll email you free access. After that, if you want to study with me personally with live lectures each week and use the proprietary tool you saw me use in this video called Ravel, there'll be an optional invite to apply and join my private group of like-minded economic rebels. Again, that's stevekeen.com or click the link in the description.